Good evening. Welcome to Columbia Law School. My name is Michael Gerard. I am a professor of environmental law here and also director of the Center for Climate Change Law. The center is co-sponsoring this event with Columbia University's Earth Institute, the Columbia Climate Center, and Climate Week NYC. This week, many leaders of the world have come to New York to talk about climate change, among other issues, and many eyes are on the United States to see what we do or do not do before the Copenhagen United Nations Conference in December. Thus, this debate could not be more timely. While I'm mentioning Copenhagen, let me also add that we are having two events on the subject in the coming weeks. On the evening of Saturday, October 3, we have a panel on Copenhagen, India, and the U.S. from conflict to cooperation. And on the evening of Monday, October 5, we have a program, the Obama Administration's Road to Copenhagen, Views from the Trenches. Both of these events are free, but advance registration is required. Also on October 23, we have an all-day conference on biosequestration and climate law and policy. Flyers on all three programs are available on the table outside. I'm going to start by going through the format that we'll be following. Then I'll give a very brief summary of the contents and status of the legislation that's the subject of our debate tonight. And after that, I'll introduce the speakers and turn it over to them. Each of our debaters will have an opening statement of 8 minutes, and then each will have a rebuttal statement of 4 minutes. Then I'll ask them some questions, and then I'll open it up to questions and answers from all of you. I will ask everyone to hold your applause till the very end. The bill we're talking about here tonight is the American Clean Energy and Security Act, H.R. 2454, also known as the Waxman-Markey bill, a very large document. It was passed by the U.S. House of Representatives on June 26 by a vote of 219 to 212. It's the first comprehensive climate bill ever passed by either house of the United States Congress. It's now being considered by 6 different committees of the United States Senate, each of which has jurisdiction over one or more pieces of it. The Committee on Environment and Public Works, chaired by Senator Barbara Boxer of California, has the lead. This committee and several others have already begun their hearings. President Obama has indicated that he would like to see final passage before the start of the Copenhagen Conference in December. The Democratic leadership of the Senate is supportive of the bill, but especially in view of the attention that has been going to health care in recent weeks, it's uncertain whether floor action before December is going to happen. If it doesn't, the Senate will take up the bill after the new year. The portion of the bill that has gotten the most attention is the cap and trade part. It would cover large stationary sources that emit more than 25,000 tons per year of greenhouse gases, as well as various refiners, producers, and importers of petroleum and natural gas, and some other sources. For each ton of greenhouse gas emission, each source would have to acquire an allowance. In the initial years of the program, about 20% of the allowances would be auctioned, the rest would be free. The percentage of allowances auctioned increases to about 70% by 2030. The income from the auction of allowances goes to various programs to reduce energy use, to foster renewable energy, to reduce deforestation, and for other purposes. There are also various provisions in the bill that would ease the price impact on low-income consumers and reduce price volatility. The total number of allowances is subject to a declining cap measured against a 2005 baseline. It's 3% below the baseline in 2012, 17% below the baseline in 2020, 42% below in 2030, and 83% below in 2050. Many of the required emissions reductions can be achieved by purchasing offsets, both domestically and abroad. The bill would preempt cap-and-trade systems set up by the states for 5 years, but not other state regulations. It would also block EPA from regulating greenhouse gases other than through the new law, with some exceptions. There are a lot of other provisions in Waxman-Markey. The bill is 1,427 pages, so all I can do is highlight a few items. The bill would require retail electric suppliers to meet certain percentages of their load through renewable resources and electricity savings. It would greatly step up the development of carbon capture and sequestration. It would advance the development of electric vehicles and smart grid technology. It would require more energy efficiency in buildings, appliances, lighting, and industry. It would provide assistance for green jobs and worker transition. It would provide offset credits for agricultural and forestry sources. There's plenty more in the bill, but this will give you the flavor of it. We're very fortunate this evening to have three experts with widely diverging views to address the bill. We will start with Dr. Stephen Cohen. He's the executive director of Columbia University's Earth Institute and also director of the Master of Public Administration program in Environmental Science and Policy at Columbia School of International and Public Affairs. He holds a PhD in political science and formerly worked at EPA. He's the author of numerous books on environmental policy and on public management. Then we will hear from Abigail Dillon. She's an attorney with the New York Office of Earth Justice, a nationwide nonprofit public interest law firm founded in 1971 as the Sierra Club Legal Defense Fund. She's actively involved in litigation concerning coal-fired power plants and other issues pertinent to climate change. Our final debater will be Roger Martella. He's a partner in the law firm of Sidley Austin. He served as general counsel of U.S. EPA from 2006 to 2008, where he was heavily involved in the agency's defense of the Massachusetts versus EPA case in the U.S. Supreme Court and in EPA's subsequent efforts to implement the court's decision. He previously was an environmental lawyer with the U.S. Department of Justice. Now I will call upon Dr. Stephen Cohen to give his opening statement, and while he's coming up, it would be a good time for everyone to make sure that their cell phones are turned off.
Thank you, Michael. So I guess I'm supposed to speak about how the Waxman-Markey bill is just right. And, of course, no legislation is just right, even this one. So let me talk to you about what I like about the bill, its comprehensive approach, some background on the economics and politics of energy and climate change, why the American political process is incremental and focuses on the political center, which is why a bill like this needs to be seen in that perspective, and why it really represents a crucial first step in American environmental law. So what do I mean by comprehensive? The fact is the climate problem is not really a climate problem, it's really an energy problem. The problem is we like to use energy in a lot of the things that we do in our daily life. When you said turn off the cell phones, you turn it off, but at night you recharge it, and that takes a lot of electricity. So here's the fundamentals. Reducing emissions is a short-term strategy. The long-term need is to reduce the use of fossil fuels and to capture, treat, or store the excess carbon dioxide that is already in the atmosphere causing global warming. At the same time, we need to maximize economic growth and continue economic growth because there's parts of the world that haven't caught up with this wonderful place yet, and they're not about to shut down their economy because of problems with global warming. So what do I mean by the comprehensive approach? Well, first, in that 1,400 some odd pages, which I think was 1,000 pages a little while ago and keeps getting longer, and I doubt anybody in Congress has read the whole thing, and I have to confess, even though I'm debating this, I haven't read the whole thing. There must be something else I'd rather read. But in any event, Title I is about clean energy, which focuses on smart grid, carbon capture and sequestration, performance standards, and research on clean energy technology. Title II focuses on energy efficiency. We waste enormous amounts of energy in this country, and so by cutting the use of energy per unit of GDP, we can actually hit the carbon problem without affecting our economic growth. Title III is the one that everybody's focusing on, which is the cap and trade to reduce global warming pollution. Title IV focuses on transitioning to a clean energy economy because the fact is getting from here to there is going to be hard. It's going to take a lot of work, a lot of time, and a fair amount of ingenuity, and it's not going to happen overnight. And Title V focuses on the offsets. Now, despite all the hubbub, the American public gets the idea that global warming is a real problem, and they understand that we need to develop alternatives to the fossil fuel-based economy we're on. They may not like it, and they may not trust the government to play a major role in it, but they know it's a real problem that has to be addressed. We have to get from here to there. We need to accelerate the pace of development of renewable energy and the technology of carbon capture and storage. This can't be done as long as fossil fuels are as cheap as they are right now. The environmental impact of fossil fuels are not included in the price that we pay, and the cap-and-trade regulatory system or a tax on carbon, either way, provides a way of raising the price of fossil fuels to make it possible for renewables to get a toehold in the marketplace. And that's absolutely essential if we're going to make this transition. In the long run, fossil fuel prices will rise because while it's not going to happen in my lifetime and probably the lifetime of the people here, we're going to run out of them. They were created a long time ago. There's only so much on the planet. And the more we dig them out of the crust of the earth and below, the more expensive it's going to get and the more damage we do to the environment. So the price is going to go up, where the price of solar and renewables, and even perhaps someday a safe version of something like nuclear, are going to go down. The same way when I was a graduate student, the computer that I used was about the size of this room and had the same computing power as my BlackBerry. Someday we're going to have advances in this technology which will allow us to lower the price of renewables and compete effectively with fossil fuels. But in order for this to happen quickly enough, government has to get in the middle of it and push harder on it, which, by the way, is one of the reasons we have the BlackBerry and have the Internet. Even though Al Gore may not have invented the Internet, it was actually a government project. Microcomputers were also a government project. This stuff was invented by the public sector and commercialized by the private sector, and that's what we have to do on renewable energy. Now, like all legislation in American politics, and most politics, Waxman-Markey represents a compromise. Lots of things I would have liked to have seen in the bill had to get dropped out to get a bill that would pass. It barely passed as it was. This is typical of lawmaking in our political process. Public policy doesn't really attempt to solve problems, but to make them less bad. Now, this is a fundamental of public policy analysis. You're moving away from the problem rather than toward a solution. Policy is remedial, it's serial, it's partial, it's incremental. We learn a bit at a time. We figure out a solution to one thing, we solve it, we move on. And the example I'll give you is crime in New York City. 15 years ago, there were 2,000 murders in the city. This year, there'll be less than 500. Now, we've definitely moved away from that problem, but we haven't solved it. We never will solve it. And for the 500 people who died last year getting killed in New York City, it certainly wasn't solved. But it's a lot less bad than it was before. Now, in terms of legislation, you look at something like Social Security. In the 30s, major and important groups of people were missing from the Social Security Act. They got added later on. The same thing will happen with this bill. Environmental legislation follows the same path. You look at the early Clean Air Act, the early Clean Water Act, they were focused on research. The key is that we have to make this transition and we have to get started. The structure of American politics pushes us toward moderate centrist positions. Why? Because the Electoral College, winner-take-all elections, the fact is, if you had a Green Party in America that won 20% of the votes in every congressional district in the country, they would have nobody in Congress. And because of that, there's a need to create consensus-driven centrist politics, and that's why this happens in the United States. This is a crucial first step. Global warming is a real problem. It has to be addressed. Its chief advantage is that it ties greenhouse gas regulation to the root cause, which is energy. The comprehensive approach goes beyond regulating just greenhouse gases and focuses on the transition to a renewable energy economy. It's far from perfect. There's lots of things I'd like to see changed in it. Over the next decade, if it passes, there'll be lots of things changed in it. But I think if we don't get started soon, the other alternative is to go back to square one. And if we keep doing this, going back to square one, pretty soon Morningside Heights will be Morningside Valley. Thanks.
Next up is Abigail Dillon.
Good evening, and thank you very much to all of the sponsors and to Mike Gerard for organizing this important event. I'm so heartened to see all of you here tonight. There's no question that the Waxman-Markey bill is a landmark. Passing an economy-wide climate bill in the House of Representatives is a big deal. But I want to suggest to you that we can push for stronger legislation. We have that opportunity before us still, and it is urgent that we do so. I was struck by a comment of the UN General Assembly, UN Secretary General in his opening remarks at the Climate Summit this week. He said, melting glaciers are, I always get it wrong when I'm thinking what someone else has said. Glaciers are melting more quickly than human progress on climate. And what's striking about that comment is that it's literally true. So I want to start this discussion by grounding us in that reality, which is the astonishing pace at which we're seeing climate change. For example, this is a satellite photo taken of Arctic sea ice at the peak of summer in 1979, just 20 years ago. Flash forward to 2007, same area, a very different picture. Let me just let you see that comparison once more. It's dramatic. In 2007, that was the record minimum of ice area. We haven't gotten the final numbers from 2008, but what we understand is that summer will set a new record. And what we are also hearing from the researchers there is that they expect the Arctic seas to be ice-free by 2015. This is 30 years ahead of the schedule that the best modelers in the world told us this would happen just a few years ago. The importance of this for our discussion tonight is that what the science keeps surprising us with is news that we are so much closer than we had thought to tipping points at which the most devastating consequences of global warming become unavoidable. And what that news tells us is there's a premium not only on passing a bill this year in advance of Copenhagen, but in passing a bill that is tailored to the scope of this problem, both its gravity and its imminence. What does a real fix for climate look like, at least in a bill that's going to pass in the United States Congress? I agree absolutely with Dr. Cohen's remarks that it has to be a comprehensive policy, and that's what the House should be congratulated upon. But there are a few key items that I think any credible policy has to achieve. One is binding emission targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions that are based on the science. And they need to be targets that are not just targets for 2050, when the politicians today and many of us in this room will no longer be accountable for delivering on those promises, but near-term targets that get us on course to a solution within the next couple of decades. And the reason I say this, the Waxman-Markey is premised on the idea that we need to stabilize CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere at 450 parts per million. Well, again, the science is out in front of the politics, and the president of the IPCC, Jim Hansen, and other eminent climate scientists are telling us that the number is lower, that it's 350 parts per million, based on what they're seeing on the ground, Arctic ice and other phenomena. And what that means is that we've already passed a key threshold. Atmospheric concentrations today are at 390 parts per million. So the debate that we're having on the Hill right now is premised implicitly on an assumption that we have a couple of decades to incrementally change the way that we live and the way that we make and use energy. But what the science is telling us is that we're already behind the eight ball, and we need to start making dramatic changes more quickly. And finally, to achieve the emissions reductions that are necessary to keep this planet in some sort of recognizable form, we've got to change our energy infrastructure. And on this, too, we can be in complete agreement. That means moving away from the most carbon-intensive sources of generating energy, conventional coal comes to mind, and really ramping up our ability to be efficient and to develop new renewable modes of generating electricity. How does the Waxman-Markey bill live up to my three criteria? I think it falls short. The reduction targets, you can see them on the screen. Let's look most in the most focused way at the 2020 target, 17% reductions in carbon emissions from a 2005 baseline. That's important. The Kyoto Protocol established a 1990 baseline. So as a frame of reference, if we were putting the politics aside and thinking purely about the science and this 350 parts per million number, we'd be thinking about a 2020 target of about 25 to 40% reductions from 1990 levels. If we were thinking about Kyoto and what we would have had to achieve if we had ratified that treaty, we'd be looking at a 7% reduction by 2012, just 2 years from now. This is a situation under the Waxman-Markey bill where we're just getting to 1.8% reductions over 1990 levels by 2020. You know, the EU is doing a lot better. They're saying 20% reductions below 1990 by 2020. I think we ought to do better as well. Getting just ahead of myself, the other thing to stress is that we're deferring the big reductions to 2030 and 2050. And so over the next 10 to 15 years, we're not doing much. The consequence of that is that we're keeping the costs of carbon low. It's not going to be driving the innovation in our energy sector that we need. And that brings me to coal. The bottom line is that Waxman-Markey gives away too much to the coal industry. And I hope that I'll have a chance to describe in a little more detail as the evening goes on why this is so. But the combination of allowing existing plants and even plants that have been recently permitted to operate indefinitely without any requirement that they ever install controls that the bill is investing lots of money in developing, creates a situation where the same fleet of coal plants that are supplying half of our electricity today will still be supplying half of our electricity come 2025. And just so you know, this isn't a far-fetched scenario. These are EPA's numbers. You'll see on your left is the reference case scenario, so business as usual. And on the right is life under Waxman-Markey. You will see the coal is represented by gray, and CCS coal plants are represented by red. There is some falling off of coal, but what you see is that we still are getting half of our energy from coal in 2025. That's going to make it financially and politically infeasible to make the major cuts in our energy electric sector emissions that we need to make not to burst the cap. And I'll end there. I think we can certainly do better.
Next up is Roger Martella.
Good evening, and Professor, thank you for the invitation, the honor to be part of this. Professor Gerard and I have known each other for a few years, and he's a very modest person. You know his reputation in New York, I know. But I want to share his reputation in D.C. In D.C., us climate change lawyers like to think we're the real experts because most of the climate change issues come out of D.C. But we know that nobody knows climate change developments better than Professor Gerard, and no one tracks these issues more, and so you're very fortunate to have him here. I'm very excited for the program that you're started and honored to be participating here. So I think it's pretty obvious why I'm here. I'm the token industry person. And I was even telling a colleague of mine today when I looked at the presentations late in the day, I said, you know, the flyer had the wind turbines, and Dr. Cohen's had the globe, and Abigail, you didn't get a good look at it, but she had the polar bears. I said, I really let down my constituents. I have no pictures of smokestacks in here. So I apologize for that. But I'm here to talk about why this is too strong. I'm not going to really talk about why I think this is too strong. I'm not going to bang on the table and say we're opposed to this. I'm going to do what Abigail's done. I'm going to talk about why I think this is too flawed, not necessarily too strong. And my goal here is not to oppose this, but to help fix the flaws so I think this legislation can do what it's supposed to do. And I want to clear up the misconception of the token industry person and how industry is approaching this. I represent about 40 companies, trade associations on climate change issues. And if you were to jot down right now the 5 companies that you think are the bad guys in the climate change debate, I probably represent all of them. But these 40 groups all have something in common that I work with, and it's important. I won't represent them if they don't. These are all groups who want to do their part to address climate change. Everybody I work with wants to be proactive at reducing their greenhouse gas emissions and addressing climate change, whether that's cap and trade, whether they're a member of US CAP, whether it's a carbon tax, whether they want to be a player on the international stage. They're all companies who are taking efforts and are willing to take additional efforts to comply with mandatory systems, and we have that in common. So when I work on the legislation, again, my goal is not up there to oppose it. My goal is up there is to help fix it and make sure it does what we want it to do. And here's what I think climate change legislation should do, and we've heard some of these themes already come out tonight. I think there's 5 key things that I would look for in a climate change bill. I'd want it to be fair. I'd want it to be comprehensive, which I think is the word we've all used the most tonight. I'd like it to be economically sustainable, effective, and realistic. And what does this mean? Well, fair means it should be fair to everybody. It should be fair to industry. It should be level playing field, not singling out some industries over others and giving them different treatments, not singling out some groups over others, making sure that there's level-handed treatment, that there's not disproportionate impacts. Comprehensive, we've talked about this. When I think about comprehensive, I think this should be the way to address climate change. If we're going to commit to this, let's commit. Let's commit 100%. But what we don't want to do is have this system and then have inconsistent obligations, whether they be other parts of the federal government, state and local claims, or common law type issues. Economically sustainable. Now, maybe I'm the first person to mention this tonight, but I think we have to think about this. The economy is an important factor in this. We can't drive greenhouse gas emissions to the point where our economy can no longer support it. What good would that do? And so we have to be thinking about how can we do this in a way that's sensitive to what technology, what the economy can currently do. Not that we shouldn't push the envelope a little bit, but we have to bring economic considerations into the discussion. Effective, to Abigail's point, it should reduce greenhouse gases at the end of the day. That's why we're doing this. We want to make sure that we're actually realizing the goal of a better environment, addressing climate change, and realistic. We're going to talk about that. So how does this do? And this is where I think there's 5 fundamental flaws. I think we're on the path, but we need to do more, and these are the issues I work on. I'm going to go through each of these, starting with, is this fair? Are we taking a fair level playing field approach to reducing greenhouse gases? And one of the reasons I have concerns is that Dr. Cohen and Professor Gerard both talked about the fundamental nature of this is if you have a ton of CO2 emissions, you have to produce an allowance. But how do you get these allowances? Well, there's a couple options. The government can give them to you, or you could go out and buy them at the outset. Well, the legislation makes a distinction between certain sectors. These sectors get their allowances for free. I'm not criticizing this. I think this is great that they're getting their allowances for free. But what about everybody else? There's a very complicated formula in here in the bill about who gets their allowances, but when you look at it, at the end of the day, there's an unlevel playing field. 427 sectors don't get their allowances. They're going to have a double whammy of reducing their greenhouse gases and at the same time having to go out on the market and buy allowances while 47 sectors do get their allowances for free. So notion, level the playing field here. Distribute them pro rata, give everybody their fair share. Don't take them away from those 47, but make sure we've got a level playing field. And again, for facilities that are smaller than those that are subject to the cap, they get treated differently as well. They have to get regulated by EPA in a way that's fundamentally different than the cap and trade. The cap and trade folks have this flexibility. They can get offsets. They can reduce their greenhouse gases. They can generate allowances. But those who are smaller get regulated by EPA in a way that's command and control, where EPA is regulating their use of energy. Again, let's think about whether we should have these dichotomy systems. Comprehensive. Now, I've both heard Abigail and Dr. Cohen talk about this as comprehensive, and here's where I fundamentally disagree. I think perhaps the most fundamental flaw of this legislation is it's entirely not comprehensive. When I think of comprehensive, again, there should be a system that we can buy into. It should be the system for the U.S., a system for reducing greenhouse gases, and be consistent. There are, on the other hand, other types of rulemakings, EPA rulemakings, for example, that would take a fundamentally different approach to not reducing greenhouse gases, but really controlling energy at the inside. There's 8 rulemakings going on today, very busily at EPA. And while Professor Gerard said, he said with the caveat, the legislation preempts EPA, but with some exceptions. The exceptions actually swallow the rule. You can drive a truck through these exceptions, and at the end of the day, EPA and state and local governments will retain their full Clean Air Act authority, meaning you will have this dichotomy of system of a market-based approach with the legislation, command and control at EPA. States will retain their authority, and private citizens will be able to bring common law nuisance suits. There's a huge debate in Washington right now. It's actually getting really interesting, where today Senator Murkowski introduced language that would actually prevent EPA from doing this while the legislation continues to be debated. It's caused a firestorm in D.C. Because right now groups are wanting to preserve this dual system of both an EPA and a cap-and-trade approach. Economically sustainable, I absolutely agree with Dr. Cohen that climate change legislation is not, well, he didn't say this, but I'll say this. It's not so much environmental legislation, it's energy legislation. It's not controlling gases coming out, it's controlling energy going in. But I'm going to take it a step further. What happens when you control energy? You control the economy. And so climate change legislation at its core is also economic legislation. This Congressional Budget Office and EPA have both recognized that. They've said the price of allowances, in order to be successful, you have to have cost containment. You have to have some economic consideration. And one element of cost containment is these offsets, these agriculture, these forestry, these methane offsets. Without those offsets, the prices of allowances, according to the Government Budget Office, or according to EPA, would double. You'd have double the cost without these offsets. The problem with the legislation, it has an offsets provision, but at the same time, when you play it out realistically, you're not going to see offsets coming online 5, 10, 15 years. And so this fundamental provision, you need these offsets to have cost containment, is fundamentally flawed because there's too many roadblocks set up before these offsets come online. The Congress is aware of this, and they're working to address this again to try to fix some of these flaws. Is it effective? And I understand Abigail's point here on, is it aggressive enough? I look at it from a little different perspective, is even if we do this in the United States, how will this affect the pictures we saw, those dramatic pictures of the polar ice cap melting? Will our actions alone make any difference without understanding some sense of global consensus? And what are the trade ramifications of this? Are we really just shifting this problem to other parts of the world that use 8 times as much energy as we do? How can we take that into consideration? And then the last thing, the question about being realistic. We both end on the same point here, but with a different view. This legislation will phase out new coal-fired power plants. It's clear. It's in there. Section 116. As of January 1st, 2009, there will be no more coal-fired power plants. There's some caveats and conditions, but realistically, that's it. Question, is that realistic? Can we really transition as of January 1st, 2009 to an economy where we can no longer rely on coal? Maybe at some point, but are we ready to do that now? Thank you.
Each speaker will now have 4 minutes of rebuttal time, starting with Dr. Cohen.
Okay, interesting set of discussions. Let me start with this. Everything in the bill will eventually be changed. All the details will keep all the lawyers in Washington working very hard for a long time, so I wouldn't worry about that. It's not going to end the coal-fired power plants by probably my lifetime and probably most of the people here, so that's a non-starter. Let me just focus on the political moment. Barack Obama won with a big majority. The Democrats have a majority in Congress. In 2010, their majority will get smaller. Every midterm election, with the exception of, I think, Roosevelt in one of his terms, had that phenomenon. That's going to happen in 2010. If there's going to be climate legislation passed in America, it's got to happen in the next 6 months. If we don't get started, we are in really deep trouble. Now, the idea of getting to 350 is ridiculous. Okay, I'm sorry, Jim Hansen, I love you, but there's no way. The economy cannot handle it. And frankly, if you dismantled the economy to get down to 350 by the time it would take to really solve the problem scientifically, there'd be so much political unrest because of the economic depression that would set in that we'd become nostalgic for the impacts of climate change. Because in fact, our cities would be burning, there'd be riots, there'd be wars, it would be pretty ugly. The fact of the matter is there's 7 billion, almost 7 billion people on the planet. We require a certain amount of economic throughput for satisfaction and for the hope of satisfaction in the developing world. we're not going to get off this merry-go-round by reducing economic growth. We actually have to figure out a way to grow our way out of this problem. And as far as I'm concerned, I mean, I hate to say it because it all comes down to these engineers, and I have to have faith in them, but we've got to figure out a way to make it so that nobody wants a coal-fired power plant because solar energy and everything else is so much cheaper. Unless we get to that point and figure out a way to get to that point, we're not going to solve this problem. So we have to keep economic growth going. We have to get started on the process of getting to renewables. We have to figure out some way of regulating greenhouse gases and get started. Every environmental bill that's ever been passed has been deeply flawed at the moment it was passed. And then it gets revised over time. But if you don't hit this political moment, if we don't get something very, very soon, whatever's on the table, we may get nothing. Now, when I was in the EPA in 1980, I worked in the Superfund program. And the Superfund program looked like it was never going to get passed. And then in December of 1980, Jesse Helms and Jim Florio sat down and cut a deal that radically changed everything we were proposing, but got us $1.5 billion and got us started. And now there have been dozens and dozens of amendments of that bill, and over time we've actually been able to get people out of harm's way and not be exposed to hazardous waste. Water started the same way, air started the same way. My response to all of this is we've got to get started with whatever is politically feasible to get the institutional capacity in EPA and in industry and in Congress working on all this. If we delay again, if all of this means, oh, it's so complicated, there's so many things we're doing wrong here that we do nothing, that would be the worst thing of all.
4 minutes to Abigail Dillon.
I'm happy to agree that doing nothing is a non-viable alternative. But let's talk about this political moment. We have a climate imperative to change the way that we create energy. We have a foreign relations imperative. We're fighting wars over energy right now. We have an aging energy infrastructure that we need to reinvest in. And we have a failing economy that we need to resuscitate. And all of those factors converge in one solution, which is a new energy economy. It's what we talked about in the election, and it's what I think people expect to come out of a climate bill. So it would be very disappointing, to say the least, if we end up with a bill that doesn't force more innovation that state initiatives are already encouraging, and that's what many of the analyses are showing, that our little state initiatives, renewable portfolio standards, are driving this about the same level of investment in renewables as we get out of the Waxman-Markey bill. It would certainly be unfortunate that after trying to slow down the coal rush, the intention to build over 150 new coal plants, we end up with a bill that only makes it more profitable to run our aging, dirty coal plants because the cost of carbon is so low, because we have very loose caps through 2020. All I'm suggesting is that there are ways that we can strengthen this bill or even adopt another approach that would force us in the next 20 years to really change the way that we do business. We don't want to end up in 2020 with a result that's close to business as usual. Here's what I would recommend. The first is tightening the cap. I hate to say that I'm not recommending necessarily the 2020 targets that would be commensurate with achieving 350 parts per million. I have to agree with you on that in this Congress. And I'm not sure that it would entail the socioeconomic disaster that you describe. I think we can fight that out on another day. But surely we can do what other developed countries are doing, and that would at least have the advantage of raising the cost of allowances and making industry decide now, rather than in 2030, that they'd rather create a renewable energy solution rather than operating the plants that they have that are bought and paid for. Certainly, we should be thinking about strengthening the renewable energy and efficiency portfolio to make renewable energy even that more attractive because it's mandated. And we should be absolutely looking at loopholes for the coal industry. There's a performance standard in this bill that suggests that plants after 2009 have to meet standards that would require them to use carbon capture and sequestration technology and really clean up their emissions. But the vast majority of plants that already exist today and which may not even be built yet, but which have been initially permitted, will never be subject to that standard, nor will they be subject to Clean Air Act requirements. So at the same time, we're investing in developing carbon capture and sequestration technology, and in fact the bill is essentially betting the planet on it. We're not requiring our existing fleet of coal plants to take advantage of that technology and to clean up or retire. That's something we have to change.
4 minutes to Roger Martella.
Thank you. I think I want to begin with 2 points that I agree with. I do think, of course, if we're going to address climate change, and we should address climate change, there's plenty of reasons to reduce greenhouse gases beyond just climate change, also energy security. We should do it through legislation. And if the time is right to do it in the next 6 months, I don't think I have a problem with that. I think that the concern is making sure we get it right in the next 6 months. And the second point, which was said, which is every environmental law, when it gets passed, it has deep flaws in it, which again is a true point and a fair point, and something environmental laws evolve over time, they develop and they get better. I do think, though, that this situation is distinguishable from that. I do think that the stakes are so high here that we have to get it right, or as right as we can, the first time around, because it will lead to ramifications immediately on the environment, on the economy, and on energy. And we have to understand what those ramifications are fully, both domestically and internationally, before we act. And maybe we can do that in the 6 months. I'm not sure. I'm not saying we can't. But I think the important thing is here, we have to look at these 3 E's. We have to look at the environment. We have to look at energy. We have to look at the economy and have a full understanding of the ramifications of what we're doing before we do it. And let's start with the environment. We've heard this number, 350 ppm. I think probably from what I can tell, we would all agree that the more realistic figure here is 450 ppm. The number where you try to keep the change in temperature below 2 degrees Celsius. We could, what I've heard, is shut down our greenhouse gas emissions today. Just shut it down. Turn off the lights, walk home, which you can do in New York, and just stop using energy. And we would still blow past 450 ppm. Because of the developing world, because of the fact greenhouse gases stay in the atmosphere for so long. So we need to understand that. We need to understand what is the action we're taking. How does it affect the environment? Are we really improving the environment? Obviously, we'll be doing something. Well, we have to look at the bigger picture, I think, again, before we take action unilaterally. As for energy, the nexus here to energy is what is the technology that's available so we can shift from coal to solar, to wind, to biofuels. Every single utility I represent, they're so excited about their renewable energy projects. They just want to be, the presidents of these companies would spend 95% of their time focused on renewable energy projects, and they're investing in this, they're developing these projects, but there's technology constraints today. They're pushing the envelope, but there's constraints. I've been to probably, one of my clients has perhaps what is the most sophisticated carbon sequestration site in the country. The amount of goodwill, they've invested millions and millions of dollars as a pilot project for this site, and yet it seems in its infancy compared to where we need to go. So these companies are doing it, but before we commit to these energy commitments that we're going to phase out coal and rely on these things, we have to fully understand what we're buying into. And then finally, the economy, because again, we start with the environment, it's really energy, and it comes down to the economy. What is going to be the impact? I can tell you sincerely that I represent manufacturing companies that this will be the final straw for them. They're struggling to stay in the U.S. They want to stay in the U.S., but when they look at the cost of these allowances, in some cases hundreds of millions of dollars are going to spend on allowances, it will break their back. They will move to the developing world. What will happen in the developing world? They will use, as in China, 8 times as much energy to produce the same amount of GDP. 8 times as much greenhouse gases for the same dollar of GDP. We have to understand that. We have to take that into account. We can't ignore it. So let's do climate change legislation. Let's do it as soon as we can. but let's have a full understanding of the environmental ramifications, the energy ramifications, and the economic ramifications of what we're doing first.
I now have some questions. I'm going to start with Dr. Cohen. Wouldn't the bill as drafted allow for so many international offsets that it might be 20 years before U.S. emissions have to be reduced? In general, don't the offset provisions greatly reduce the incentive to cut emissions here?
Yes, they do. I think that a lot of the problems that people have been raising are problems that I see with the bill as well, and I do hope that some pieces of this thing will be cleaned up a little bit before it goes into place. I think that the most important part of the bill, frankly, is not the cap and trade and not the offsets. It's actually the part that helps to encourage the renewable energy industry and the energy efficiency part of our economy. And this is not the only place it's happening. I also think the most important part is simply setting in motion a climate regime. In other words, the first step of a long process. I would expect that if we get a bill this year, next year there'll be an amendment, a set of amendments, and the following year and the following year. So I don't disagree with the idea that it's a flawed piece of legislation. It's a Christmas tree. They hung 1,400 different ornaments on it, as near as I can tell. But it seems to be the only thing that's going to get through this Congress, and I think for a lot of reasons, the capacity has to come about this year. One of the things about agenda setting in American politics is the way that the established interests that my colleague on the left represents veto legislation is just this way, pointing out all of the problems with it. So in the end, we throw up our hands and say, okay, we'll try again next year. But next year, we're politically weaker and nothing happens. So my concern here is taking what comes through this sausage-making process called legislation, take what we can get, go home, and try to improve it next year.
Question for Ms. Dillon. What makes you think that you'll ever get 60 votes in the United States Senate to have the stronger bill that you want? Isn't the only way to get 60 votes to make the bill weaker rather than stronger?
I don't think that's so, but that is the prevailing wisdom. I think the real wild card here is the administration. And until the administration really weighs in, until President Obama really weighs in and makes it understood that this is a priority for him, I think that the Congress is going to continue to run loose. And I'm very concerned that a few senators can hold up this legislation entirely. One thing that we hear whenever we're on the Hill is, can you guys bring out your folks and have them call our offices? Right now, people who are listening to talk radio are calling by the hundreds to every senator on the Environment and Public Works Committee. And they're not hearing from the majority of the American public who really wants a bill this year and who wants a stronger bill. Until we really work both what we call the inside game and get EPA involved and get President Obama involved, and until we work the outside game, and not only in this country, but leading up to Copenhagen, Congress and this administration are going to be under significantly more pressure than they have been already. And with China's recent announcement that it's going to take serious steps, China said we're moving forward. So the argument about unilateral action, I think, is less persuasive than it once was. We can't get a stronger bill if we don't try. And there are really, there's an interesting convergence of events on the international scene. EPA is making movements that it's going to be regulating. If we don't get a bill this year, I think that gives the administration some more leverage to try to get what it wants out of the Senate. Obama has indicated that he's going to be rolling up his sleeves and working more concertedly on this. And I can tell you we won't get a bill that's any better if we take the attitude that we can't. We've gotten a little more time because healthcare has taken the stage. Let's use this time as a community to rally the troops. And, if it takes getting out in the streets to get a climate bill that matters, there's no better time for that. Rivers were on fire and we got really strong legislation, the strongest legislation in the world. So my hope is that the people in this room will walk away and not only call your senators, but call everybody you know.
Question for Mr. Martella. The bill calls for a 42% reduction in emissions below a 2005 baseline by 2030. Do you believe that that kind of reduction in emissions is necessary in order to stave off the worst effects of climate change? And if so, how would you get there?
Well, thank you. And it gets to a question you get a lot when you go to these cocktail parties and they know you do this thing. And they say, well, what's the deal? Is this really for real? And what do you think about climate change? And what I normally tell people is I'm not a scientist. And I have to defer to those who are. And I generally look to the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And I look, if they say this is credible, they want a Nobel Prize, I have to go with them. And so to some extent, I think your question touches on science about whether you can get to 42% by 2030. I think what I would say to that is I want to put it back in the context of the relevance of this depending on what the rest of the world is doing. We can do anything. This nation can adapt. My clients can adapt. We can come up with the technology. We can invest the money to do it. But if we're getting 42% reductions by 2030 and China's increasing its greenhouse gas emissions by 100% by 2020, what have we done in the meantime, and how has that affected both the environment and the economy along the way? So when I look at these types of targets and things, I sometimes question their relevance. This number may become entirely relevant and come January if we have an agreement in Copenhagen and we all have a sense of how the world is contributing to solving what is fundamentally a global problem. But the U.S. alone, reducing any amount of greenhouse gases without knowing what the rest of the world is doing, I think only, again, has limited relevance.
Well, but let me press you on the second part of the question. How would you get to a 42% reduction by 2030? We've heard a lot of problems with the bill, but what would you do differently that would still achieve the same reductions?
I think a couple of things. I would look to the renewable energy portfolio. I would look both from a mobile source perspective and a stationary source perspective. One of the things none of us talked about tonight, we've been talking a lot about smokestacks and coal-fired power plants. What about on the other side of the equation, cars and fuels? EPA is working on a rulemaking as we speak. The comment period closes this Friday that will promote cellulosic biofuels, sugar cane from Brazil, woody biomass from forest in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. All these fuels will have life cycles of greenhouse gases that are relatively lower than petroleum. Not that petroleum will go away, but we have opportunities there to take that. We have opportunities among the utility suppliers to look at nuclear, to look at other types of alternative fuels. And so to me, I think what we want to be able to do is preserve the nation's gross domestic product, preserve the GDP, but find not only more energy efficient ways to do there, but other renewable types of energy to get to those goals.
I'm now going to open it up for questions. In front of each of you is a microphone with a button. When I call on you, please press the button so that the people in the spillover room will be able to hear you, and so that the people who will listen to this when we put it online will be able to hear you. Yes, sir.
I've got a question for your colleague to my right. I say that. That's supposed to be funny. Everyone's supposed to laugh. He's obviously going to be to my right. I think he's to the right of you as well. First of all, I think your logic and your rationale is bass backwards. I don't think that. For
the record, he's looking at Mr. Martella.
And for the record, I get this all the time.
The individual to my far right. I don't think the question should be, we need to look at what the rest of the world is doing. I think the question should be, the rest of the world is looking to us to see what we're doing. And we have the moral imperative, as well as the national security imperative, as well as the economic imperative and the environmental imperative, to lead, not to follow. And the rest of the world is not going to jump ahead of us on this. They're going to look to us and see what we do. So the litmus test, all this in the weeds talk is important and it's crucial. But the litmus test ought to be, are we going to do something in the ramp up to Copenhagen that is taken seriously? That ought to be the only question, I think, is what we're doing a serious effort. Because if it's not, no one's going to follow.
I think your point is an entirely fair one. There is something to be said for the notion that we should lead, and maybe other nations won't come along until the U.S. leads. I don't dispute that at all. I think the qualification I have to that is, if we're going to do that, we really need to understand the ramifications, as I've talked about, of what we're getting into. I have 3 young children, and I've spent a summer living in the building right next to this one when I was in New York, and I think very highly of this neighborhood. And I would love them to go to Columbia and live in Morningside Heights, not Morningside Valley, as you said. So I'm worried. Like everyone else, I want my children to grow up in a world where the environment's a very strong one, but they also need a strong economy. I worry as much about them getting jobs and making sure that what we're agreeing to do today is done in a way that, yes, we should lead, we should take action, but where do we draw that line? Can we do something that shows we're leading, but at the same time is sensitive to the international trade ramifications of this, the leakage issues, and the economic issues? And that's what I'm saying. Let's take all this into consideration before we go ahead and take that step in what we're getting into. But thank you for that.
Let me make a point about the economy on this, because I think that is one of the most important points. And the way I would look at it is, in fact, we need to force this technology of renewable energy into our economy. We need to do it in a way that actually builds a stronger economy in the future. And frankly, a fossil fuel-based economy is going to be a dinosaur. It's going to be a dinosaur because of costs, and it's not going to take that long for this to happen. Somebody out there, and maybe it's in China, maybe it's some scientist in Beijing, is going to invent a cheap solar cell that's going to get commercialized. I'd like that to be in this country, or at least I'd like us to be able to get hold of it. In fact, I'd like us to be focused on all of that technology to make our economy more cost competitive. You often hear industry saying, if you regulate us, you're going to put us out of business. We're not going to be competitive with the rest of the world. And it's kind of funny. The story I often think about, now our auto industry did go under for a lot of reasons. But I don't think it was because of regulation, because all the other cars have to have the same stuff. But part of it's sort of the culture and the way these companies think. In 1970, when Gaylord Nelson was pushing the Clean Air Act, he was thinking very seriously about banning the internal combustion engine. It was because the automobile industry said we can never make cost-effective catalytic converters. And I think within about a week of that hitting the agenda in a serious way, the automobile industry was in front of Congress with a couple of working catalytic converters. Amazing how the technology could be developed that quickly. I think if we put in place a regulatory regime to focus on renewables and create a cap on carbon, American ingenuity is going to respond to a very good high-tech and some low-tech renewable energy industry, which will actually have the impact of revitalizing our economy globally. So this idea that somehow adding a regulatory requirement makes companies less competitive, it doesn't always work that way, and particularly when you talk about cutting-edge technology. So I just want to introduce that idea into the equation here.
Other questions? In the back row.
This is a question for all three, and it relates to the last question. How do you see either the bill as it exists, a different bill, stronger or reconfigured, I won't say weaker, integrating with the Copenhagen talks, and where does this fall? Is it a chicken and egg thing? What's the right approach in light of the international negotiations?
Who wants to start?
I think for us to be credible at Copenhagen, we've got to either have something passed or be really close to it. In fact, it'd be much better to have it. If we don't have something, Copenhagen is going to be a nice party, but nothing's going to happen. So I think it's extremely important that the United States get out front and do something. I believe it has to be credible. I think what we have on the table is flawed but credible.
I agree. I think the assumption was going into coming out of the House was that the Senate would have a bill on the table now, and we would be marking it up, and we would have something in hand to take to Copenhagen, and everyone viewed that as a necessity, and I still view it as a necessity. We have to think about a plan B. It's crucial that the Murkowski amendment that Roger mentioned earlier that would strip EPA of its authority to regulate stationary sources doesn't pass. If Congress doesn't get its act together in advance of December, we absolutely need to demonstrate a credible path that EPA can take with its own regulatory authorities under the Clean Air Act. But, you know, I agree that it would be much better to show that the American Congress is serious about this. The one thing I will take issue with just a bit is the international perception of the Waxman-Markey bill. You know, I think everyone appreciates that it's important a climate bill is finally passed a House of Congress, but I don't think there's a general perception that it's a tremendously strong effort. And I think the very minimal emissions reductions that the bill calls for in the first 20 years are a problem. If it's true that we can rely entirely on international offsets through 2020 and do nothing in this country to reduce our emissions, I don't think that's going to fly with the international community.
I think there's two options for Copenhagen. I think one option will be that we can go and say that we've passed climate change legislation not only by the House but by the full Congress, and therefore we're serious and we're hitting the ground running, and we're looking forward to seeing what you're going to do. I do think, though, we should talk just for a second about the second option that Abigail mentions, because we shouldn't understate this, and it's probably the more likely scenario. I think the more likely scenario is what can we say about EPA? Between now and December, EPA is very likely to make a finding that greenhouse gases endanger human health and public welfare. They are going to announce that by March of 2010, they will enact the first greenhouse gas regulations that will trigger a whole cascade of other types of regulations. And even with this Murkowski amendment, that will not stop it. Let's say an unlikely scenario passes. These greenhouse gas regulations for cars will still go forward. So I would anticipate that regardless of whether it's legislation or not, there will be a very strong and aggressive message by the Obama administration. And what the message may be is, we don't have legislation, but we have a full suite of options under the existing laws. It may not look like cap and trade, it may be different, but at the end of the day, we're going to be reducing greenhouse gases. We're committing ourselves to doing it. We're going to start doing it in March 2010. And that's another way of showing how serious we are as we're debating the legislation. And my impression is on an international stage that will be impressive. That will show we're committed enough that we're using this mechanism, the Clean Air Act, which is not the preferred mechanism, but committing to it anyway and moving forward.
Yes, sir.
The Waxman-Markey bill is, I think, officially titled the American Climate, Energy, and Security Act. And the third element, security, is something that hasn't been talked about much, but the Pentagon is busily running scenarios about how they're going to cope with the prospect of 1 billion climate refugees. And I'm wondering why that's not talked about more and why that's not something that's driving the passage of a strong bill.
Probably because it's not going to happen. You know, there are 7 billion people on the planet. 1 billion of them are not going to be climate refugees. So, I mean, I wouldn't make that prediction in any event. The seriousness of the problem is really, I mean, it's a real problem, and it's a very serious problem that has to be addressed. It's interesting the degree to which, you know, it's either too much or it's too little. The fact is, if you're careening off a cliff, slowing down is a good idea, okay? Maybe you're not slowing down as fast as you'd like to slow down, but slowing down is really the first thing you do. You start move your foot to the brake. Then you start realizing, wait a minute, we really got to hit the brake fast because we're going over the cliff. Right now, we're still careening over the cliff. No legislation. Forget about EPA using its existing authority, because they could have done that already. I mean, they do have authorities to do some things, but not enough. And it's certainly not enough on renewable energy, okay, which is not inside EPA's purview. Getting something done now is essential. The issue of security, you know, I don't think we're going to get to the point, frankly, where we have so much global warming that we're going to have 1 billion refugees, but mainly because of other things that are going to happen, particularly in the development of new low-carbon technology. You know, the point about all of these kinds of things is that this country and the planet's political regimes are pretty good at dealing with really bad potential catastrophes, believe it or not. Otherwise, we still wouldn't be around here 60 years after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So that we have figured out ways to survive. I suspect we will on this one as well.
If I could just say something brief on, I think your question is a great one. It's something I've thought about a lot. The first climate change legislation we ever passed was on December 17th of 2007, about 2 years ago. And it was called the Energy Independent Security Act. It reduced greenhouse gases from renewable fuels and cars. No one ever called it a climate change bill. No one wanted to call it a climate change bill, but it really was a climate change law. This current ACESA is actually never refers to climate. It's the American Clean Energy and Security Act. And I think it shows there's this reluctance, perhaps by strategic people on the Hill, that we're not ready to commit to something called a climate change law yet, but these other names people seem to all agree with. So I think your question goes to the point that this is a climate change law, but even today in 2009 when it was introduced back in the spring, there was still this reluctance to call it what it is, just like there was a reluctance back in 2007 to call the Energy Independent Security Act what it was at the time as well.
Can I just respond briefly? Sure. I have a more cynical view, and that is that we cater to the self-interest of people in this country, and I don't think that there's been a real concern about refugees in other countries or the effects of climate change that are already being felt. There is a energy independence argument that is being made, and it's very compelling. We're in a race right now with China and India to figure out who's going to be the leader in a new energy economy, and we want it to be us, and we want the green jobs that go with that kind of leadership. And so that's a message that is true and that's being pressed. But I think, this country is very slow, particularly in the climate debate, to take on the moral obligation that it really ought to.
I have a written question from the other room, and it is directed to Ms. Dillon. The current text of the bill would allow a levy on carbon-intensive goods from foreign countries. Wouldn't this hurt U.S. consumers and producers insofar as these carbon-intensive goods are used in manufacturing in this country?
Well, I think the shortest answer to that is that every single analysis, CBO, EPA, EIA, that's a variety of perspectives, have all looked at the bill, and what they say it's going to cost the American consumer is less than a postage stamp a day. And you may have heard that message before. But I'm not an economist. I can only look at those numbers and say that, I think given the costs that are associated with climate change, spending 25 to 40 cents to remedy this threat is probably worth it to most American households.
Yes, sir.
When the Senate creates a bill, and if it fails, what will happen in the next 3 years under EPA regulations of greenhouse gases? Will they be able to make a cap and trade or regulate it effectively?
It's a really good question, and I'll tell you, that's the single biggest issue in Washington right now on this climate change. We came back from the August recess, and when we went into the August recess, all the momentum was with Congress and this legislation, and people weren't really paying attention to EPA. When we came back, the momentum had totally flipped, in my view, where now people are looking, the legislation is losing momentum, EPA is gearing up to regulate, and it's more likely than not, I think it's almost a certainty that EPA is going to be regulating before we see legislation. The answer to your question, let's assume Murkowski doesn't pass. We'll take that off the table for now, and we're in a neutral world here. The EPA will begin to regulate cars in March of 2010, and they will quickly turn to stationary sources. They will start to regulate coal-fired power plants, new coal-fired power plants, sometime in 2010. They'll propose a rule in early 2010, finalize that in late 2010. Then they'll start turning to petroleum refineries, cement kilns. And so they will be able to do a comprehensive strategy to address greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act. Now, there's a couple distinctions, though, between that and the legislation. First of all, where the legislation is a market-based approach, you can trade emissions, you can trade your greenhouse gases, you can decide not to lower it if you want to pay somebody else. EPA's approach would be command and control, where every single facility would be subject to regulations and every facility would be subject to the same types of control. So there's less flexibility there, which is why almost everyone prefers legislation over EPA regulation. The other challenge is the timing of this. It's going to take a while for EPA to get around to everybody. It'll probably take them a long time. They're going to start with the low-hanging fruit and the big guys. But even when they go after the coal-fired power plants, they have limited resources to address existing sources. Really, this is focused on new sources. So I would imagine from some people's perspective, again, that's a less attractive option. They would rather see the cap and trade because it can come into effect quicker. There is a discussion right now that we're hearing from environmental groups is that they don't want an either-or proposition. They want both the cap and trade and they want EPA to regulate at the same time because they feel, for the reasons we've heard, they don't think the cap is stringent enough. EPA can continue to ratchet things down more aggressively than the cap can in some instances.
You know, America has a lot of coal, and we're going to keep using it to generate electricity. But the coal itself is not just producing greenhouse gases. It produces other pollutants, and when you get it out of the ground, it does pretty bad things to the groundwater nearby. You may have seen some articles about that in the Times over the weekend about West Virginia. So part of what we have to be thinking about with this fossil fuel economy is not just its impact on carbon dioxide and on global warming, but in fact the full environmental accounting of what it costs us to get this stuff out of the ground over the long run. And so part of what's not being put into the cost equation here, I mean, everything's looked at one source at a time or one pollutant at a time, but we actually live in an interdependent system. And so we are going to be dependent on these fossil fuels for a while. We've got to get started on the transition. Waxman-Markey is actually the first comprehensive bill that I've ever seen that attacks each piece of the problem in all the flawed ways you've heard about. If this goes down, and you can hear industry is pushing very hard to retreat from, the legislation had momentum and all the rest of that in the media. What they're doing is they're taking the agenda setting process, trying to remove this as a major item, put health in front of it, put anything in front of it. Just let's not have this kind of legislation get out of this Congress. I think if this legislation goes down, it will be a major defeat for the United States and its future. This idea that somehow environmental regulation kills economies is really something we have to get past. Most of the environmental regulation that we've had in America has contributed to economic growth. I mean, just a small example in this city. Ask yourself, why is Riverside Drive a quarter mile from the river? It's because the Hudson River used to be a moving sewer. You never would want to get too close to it. We used to dump raw sewage in the Hudson until 1983 when we finally built the North River plant north of here. Now you can ride your bicycle along the river. Even Donald Trump is putting up apartment buildings. Not that I'm in favor of all this, but the fact is all that economic value was created because we invested in clean water and we've invested in clean air, which is why when you get off the airplane in New York City, you can still breathe. When you do it in Bogota or Mexico City, you can see the air. Those things have economic value. We have to start thinking about the fact that this trade-off between environment and economic development that we keep hearing about, and Washington is still keeping this argument alive for very short-run interest, is an old, bankrupt argument we've got to get past.
Can I just... I agree with that wholeheartedly, and I just want to follow up on a really important point you made. In the truly unfortunate event that we do not get a bill this year, I just wanted to add to the list of things that EPA could do. Steve is making the important point that fossil fuels do all sorts of bad things in addition to drive climate change. And just looking at coal alone, if coal really had to pay the true costs of the water pollution it creates, both at the mining stage and at the stage of disposing of coal ash, it would be a much more expensive fuel. So, for instance, right now in Congress, we're pushing for standards to regulate disposal of coal ash. EPA could make rules to regulate coal ash under RCRA as a hazardous waste. That would increase the cost of coal and create a more level playing field for renewables. There are many things at the coal mining stage that could be done as well, and all of these apply to extraction of natural gas, which is going forward here in New York and Pennsylvania. If we have true environmental regulation that forces industry to internalize the costs of its environmental harms, I think we would
clear more of the market for the renewable and clean energy alternatives that we want to see.
In the back.
I was just wondering what your thoughts were on another type of carbon pricing, which would be a carbon tax as opposed to the cap and trade system. Because one of the reasons that we haven't been seeing the innovation on the scale we need is because our system of capitalism isn't telling the truth, because it's hiding the ecological impacts in the prices. Now that's one of the problems with cap and trade, is because it's so complex and it's this whole other system, it's still going to be hid from much of the market. So why not put in place an economy-wide carbon tax, supplement that with a shifting in income taxes, and then use consumers and the markets as a force for the greatest change we need instead of government regulation and bureaucracies?
Okay, I like bureaucracies. If you could get it through the Congress, a carbon tax is not a bad idea. It's not politically feasible. We can barely get the regulation through. I mean, in essence, a command and control regulation that raises prices is a tax on carbon. So it's not the most direct way to do it. I mean, why is gasoline not taxed at a higher level than it is today? I mean, there's a lot of things that you'd want to do if you could, but raising taxes is the third rail of American politics. That's why they don't call this a global warming bill. That's why they don't call anything a tax if they can avoid it. I think it's unfortunate that the dialogue doesn't allow that kind of honesty, but there we are.
In back, yes. Yes.
What would you say the consequences of the Copenhagen meeting will be? We discussed that if it goes down and the U.S. does not deliver the goods, everyone will walk away from Kyoto. But I'd like to look almost beyond this whole debate and say, let's say everyone gives us the thumbs up and gives China the thumbs up. What are we looking at over the next 5 years in terms of an international debate on creating a program for fighting climate change?
Well, I guess it's up to me. If Copenhagen, after Copenhagen, I guess what I really do see is, in fact, there's a tremendous drive worldwide toward alternative energies and energy efficiency. And I think over the long run, that's going to be the focus because it really attacks the root cause of all these problems. And so I think you're going to see more effort going internationally. A lot of times these changes in technology are very difficult to predict. I remember, my father had a mobile phone in his car in the 1970s, and it was the size of this podium, I think. And now we've got these things, and nobody really imagined you could get to that point. I think we've got to really focus on, when I heard during the presidential campaign this idea of a kind of moonshot initiative, which you often hear, but focused on renewable energy, I thought, that's really what has to happen in this country and globally. And I think that attacks the root cause of this problem. Now, the fossil fuel industry, to some degree, won't like it if it happens too quickly because it'll put them out of business. But I think they're also, as you've heard, investing in this as well. I think the other technological fix is the one my colleague Klaus Lochner is working on, called carbon capture and storage. And not just at the plants, but he's actually invented a little tree that collects carbon dioxide from the air in some pretty impressive ways. And so I think you're going to see a variety of technologies developing. The alternative is really stark for the world economy. So I really hope we're able to do this.
Yes, my question is for all three of you, but especially for Mr. Cohen. And thinking about the political moment, I thought that was a brilliant point, and the agenda setting and centrist tendencies in American politics. But this financial crisis is far from over. The green shoots talk is really kind of nutty. The bank bailout really has caused a lot of damage, even to the Obama administration, because they have Geithner, who's associated with it, and Obama's been backing it too. And the healthcare debate has been really ugly with all the racial overtones that are almost impossible to miss. Do we have enough political capital to do anything? I think I'd be pessimistic on that level. And what also about consumers paying more money? I mean, there's, we bash industry all the time, and I probably bash industry quite a bit too. But no one who's a consumer wants to pay more. And except for the poorest citizens, most people should pay more for energy and get used to that, either now or later, preferably now, so we can escalate the costs in a more controlled fashion. So commentary on that. Thanks.
It's a tough political moment. I think that we've certainly advanced things over a year ago today, but it's a kind of tricky moment. You know, we're seeing a lot of ebb and flow right now. All of the counter reaction to what Obama and his colleagues tried to put in motion are coming back. But I think that there's an economic reality to this. I think you sort of alluded to that. You know, the economy got into trouble because we were, over-borrowed. Our economy is in trouble because we haven't been focusing on these fundamental issues of productivity. And I think that we do have to start thinking about how to invest in the future and how to build for the future. And we're a very short-sighted, short-term oriented culture. We like our benefits right away. So the question is, how do you move from here to there? Now, we have some policy instruments in place that are actually doing some of these things, and I think this bill would be another thing. For example, you may not know it, but in New York State, you pay a surcharge on your electric bill every month, which this year will generate about $500 million for energy efficiency projects. In California, the same tax now, I don't know if they call it a tax, but whatever they call it, generates over $1 billion a year, which is one of the reasons why California is the most energy efficient state in the union. So we're able to do these kinds of things, and I think we're going to do more of them. And I think as the awareness of these issues grows, we'll do even more. So, there's reasons to be optimistic, there's reasons to be pessimistic, but you've just got to keep pushing along and try to convince people that this is in their long-term interest. But the short term is what dominates economy and politics in this country and all over the world.
Yes, sir.
I fear I've got to be a shill for industry too, and in the sense that I'm a project finance lawyer, so I'm agnostic as to the types of energy projects that you have, but there are certain things that have been mentioned that I think it's important to focus on. First, for some, let's say, dirty secrets in the industry. Every wind project, or has in close proximity to it, a building that is called the gas-fired power plant. The reason is because there's a difference between base load generation, which can run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and what is called peaking power being that it's available at certain peak periods. Unfortunately, the wind doesn't always blow, and when the wind doesn't blow and people want their homes to have power, they have to get it from another source, and that source is fossil fuel. And if you're going to do it on a peaking basis, you have to do it through natural gas because it doesn't make sense to do it from coal. Similarly, if you try and do things with the sun doesn't shine at night. Essentially what you have to have is alternate sources. So if you're talking about alternate sources and you're talking about base load power, because you really do need sources of power, that leads you to the following questions. One, do you favor nuclear power? And again, I can be agnostic as to whether nuclear is good or bad, but the question is, what do you use as an alternative? Secondly, even with respect to renewables, there are issues that haven't really been talked about that become exceedingly important in this debate, such as land use and water rights, and the difficulty in terms of getting project development in various parts of the country. One final point that I'd like to just touch upon, and that is Professor Cohen talked about California being the most energy efficient state in the country. That's true, but there's something else that has to be noted as well. One is California farms out most of its electricity. It buys most of its electricity from outside the state of California. One of the problems that you have in the state of California, it is virtually impossible to try and develop a power plant there. And one of the difficulties that you run into essentially has to do with CEQA, or has to do with trying to run through the gauntlet of NEPA because of the fact that the federal government is one of the largest owners of land, and getting things through the Bureau of Land Management is exceedingly difficult. So I guess the question that I'd pose to the panel is, it's very important to try and address the issues of climate change, but at the same time, right now there aren't alternatives that are available, and the alternatives that are available, specifically nuclear and others, have been basically rejected. So what would you use for the transition period?
I actually didn't say that I thought the technology was available. Let me be very clear about that. I don't think the technology is available. But imagine that you generate, through research and development, a more efficient solar cell and a solar battery or a battery technology that allows you to store the energy when the wind doesn't blow and when the sun doesn't shine. These are not unimaginable technologies if you talk to the people who work here on these kinds of issues. It's true, project finance doesn't work for a lot of this because it's very risky and it's not reliable at this point, which tells you that we need more money focusing on basic R&D before the stuff can become commercialized. I think we have a lot of work to do, and a lot of the work is in the basic R&D. And of course, I work for a university that does a lot of the R&D, so I'm a special interest here.
Let me just say we started about 10 minutes late, so we're going to go to about 10 after 8. Go ahead.
You've laid out the problems that are associated with all renewable development and all energy development, for that matter, very articulately. What I would say is interesting about the climate debate is that nobody knows how we're going to solve these problems yet. We're assuming that putting a price on carbon is going to elicit solutions from industry and perhaps help with some of the siting issues and so forth. What Waxman-Markey really focuses on is another question, and that is how are we going to get CCS up and running at commercial scale? And the bill assumes that if you throw $150 million at it, it will happen. So if we were to do the same with renewables, can we make the same assumptions? I think so. You have the same water issues with CCS. You have the same siting issues, if not worse. I mean, people are very concerned about having a coal reservoir under their home. You have just the enormity of the problem of finding enough space to put all of that CO2. So. And I don't want to duck your question about nuclear, because everybody always does. And I guess our view at Earth Justice is that we have to keep all the options on the table. So if there is some way that we can figure out how to store the waste that's safe, then let's start thinking about that too. But what we don't want to have is a bill that has a unavoidable tilt toward coal and all the problems that CCS entail, just assuming that we can achieve the energy that we need through renewables.
And I just want to mention quickly, your question reinforces how proud I am of some of what I do. What I don't do is spend time, trying to fight things. I look at the clients I'm working on with, these big industrial clients. Here's what I've done in the last week. I've worked with one on how they can promote a smart grid technology across a significant portion of the Midwest to help their customers use less energy, be more energy efficient. Another company, going right to your question, is developing battery technology at their wind farms that they can store energy during those peak times. And this is a company doing this because they want to be able to use these wind farms more often. So they're asking me, how can we help work with the government to make sure the government likes this technology and we can use this as a pilot project. Major auto manufacturers is turning truck assembly lines into advanced fuel vehicle fleets to be more energy efficient and to design cars for the next generation. And then a high technology company that's never had anything to do with any environmental issue has come to me and say, how can we use our technology, our broadband technology, to help reduce greenhouse gases? And so it reinforces that the innovators out there, it's the government, it's academics, it's people like Earth Justice, but it's also these companies that are sticking their own necks out, saying this is what we want to be devoting more of our time to, overcoming the challenges that you've identified.
I'd like to know what you think the Waxman-Markey bill brings with regard to price signals, because at the end of the day, in very concrete terms, transportation and electricity production are the main sources of CO2 emissions, and we haven't addressed it much in the conversation tonight. But how can we bring people to change the way they live their lives to bring about those CO2 emissions? And are the price signals to bring about those changes in the bill as it is now?
My view is that they are not, and it's because the cap has enough room under it that the price of allowances remains very low in the early years of the program, and by that I mean the first 25 years of the program. And so, what we see as a solution is one of two things: either tighten the cap and raise the price of carbon so that you have a signal that's really driving the market, or complement the cap with regulatory measures and force industry to change so that people, whether they like it or not, are getting their electricity from different kinds of sources. And on the transportation side, we're doing that. EPA is coming out with what we hope will be very aggressive tailpipe rules, and DOT with new CAFE standards that will demand greater fuel efficiency, so that there will be, some assurance that we're changing the way we live. But you're getting to the nub of the problem. How do we change the way ordinary people live their lives, as opposed to changing the way industry makes cars or industry generates electricity? And I think there are lots of ways to design a program and figure out how to give away allowances or auction allowances and use the proceeds to protect the most vulnerable populations from economic hardships that they can't bear, and really create a direct price signal that would impact you and me more directly. And I think that's the debate that we've been very reluctant to have in this economy.
I think it's interesting that the industry lobbyists are talking about how this is going to be ruinous, and the environmental community is saying it's not enough. I think that if you're a corporate planner right now and this thing gets passed, one of the things you're thinking about is, maybe not just yet do I have to worry about this, but this is coming, and I better start thinking and investing in this direction. And I think that's one of the signals that's being sent. But I think this idea that we're going to change how Americans live is ridiculous. Okay? Americans like the way they live. I don't like living in the suburbs. That's why I live here. But most people like it. They like driving around in their cars to the mall and all the rest of that stuff. And the idea that somehow public policy is going to change that is really, it's heading in the wrong direction. It's simply not going to happen. What we've got to do is make sure that their homes and their cars are moving around and being powered by something other than fossil fuels. People, yes, the structure that we created, the subsidies for the interstate highways and all the rest of that created all this, but it's all there. Some people are going to move back into cities. You're going to see some greater density. All of that's going to happen. But the fundamentals aren't going to change. And the amount of energy being used worldwide is going to grow. So the real question is, how do we get off of this path, and how do we start the transition? It's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take a while to do. And we have to get started intensely as quickly as possible. And my concern right now, in fact, is that the momentum that came out of President Obama's election and inauguration and this Congress here is starting to dissipate, and that this is like an hourglass, and I see the hourglass running out of sand. And I think that if we don't take advantage of this opportunity at this moment, we're going to regret it. And I am a little bit afraid of that. On the other hand, I think that these folks in the Democratic Party want to get reelected next time. So they've got to get the economy going again, they've got to get a health bill, and they've got to get a piece of climate legislation passed. Otherwise, they're not going to be going to the electorate with a successful administration. So my hope is that, the politics in this media age with all this web stuff and the 24/7 news, it kind of goes back and forth really quickly. So now we see the tide going out. I think sometime before December the tide's going to come back in, but we'll see.
I guess I maybe want to respond just to the notion of industry saying this is ruinous. Maybe some people believe that. I don't think I believe that. And I want to share a story that when the legislation came out, within a couple hours, people were calling me up about this provision that Abigail referred to, Section 116. And 116 is the phase-out new coal-fired power plants provision. Very specific, saying you can't build a new coal-fired power plant unless it produces less than 800 megawatts of CO2 less than 800 pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour, which means you have to use natural gas. My very good friend, David Bookbinder from the Sierra Club, had been advocating for this for months, and I kind of thought he was crazy. And I called David up and said, David, congratulations. I totally disagree with this. I don't know how you got this in there, but, congratulations. It's a tremendous feat. You got this provision in the legislation. And David said to me, he said, Roger, I'll be honest with you. I had nothing to do with this. This was a proposal from U.S. CAP. And he sent me an email. He said, look at this. Look at footnote like 11. And sure enough, U.S. CAP had proposed to Congress that when it passes legislation, it should phase out coal-fired power plants as of January 1st, 2009. Well, if you don't know who U.S. CAP is a coalition of industry groups and environmental groups, including a number of very large energy groups who are basically, to this extent, writing themselves out of their core business model. So I want to just, hopefully leave, if I leave with one point, not having these characterizations that industry is always opposed to this and other groups are always in favor of it. I think what I've tried to make the point tonight, these are finer distinctions in here. It sounds like Abigail and I have the same message. We're identifying flaws. We want to address these flaws. We're coming at it from two very different perspectives. But this is not I'm not here banging on the table. My clients aren't banging on the table saying that we can't do this. No way, no how.
Our hourglass has run out. How about a good round of applause for our three speakers? Thank you all for coming, and I hope you come to some of our upcoming programs. Good night.